Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good day and welcome to the show on this Sunday. Thank you for tuning in to Story Time. Um, this story today is a very interesting story. It's about when I used to go to school back when I was I know exactly what age I was. I was 14 years old. And at the school that I went to, I was bused 20 miles away from home to a school in Umatilla, Florida. And the interesting thing about it was there was they were uh, trying to be state champions of the football team in the Umatilla High School, and they were trucking boys in from places like uh, I think there was a sheriff's boys ranch. I think there was also a juvenile detention center or whatever. I'm just not exactly sure because a long time ago. I mean, I was only 14 years old. But I do know a lot of these boys, you call them boys, they're actually men. Like some of them have missed so many grades. I mean, they're almost 20 years old, 18, 19 years old, 17 years old, and they're actually men at that age, and they were going to school with kids. We were all kids, at the school. I mean, I was 14, and I was a little bit large for my age, but still, I wasn't as big as a man. I was still only a 14-year-old boy. A boy cannot take on the strength of a man. It's just it's simple math and physics and the laws of strength. I mean, it's like if you saw a sumo wrestler come into the ring and you seen a little 100-pound shrimp come into the ring, a 100-pound man come into the ring against a sumo wrestler, he's not going to stand much of a chance. Even if he knows karate or whatever, it doesn't matter. Strength is strength. Anyway, these young men at this school, a lot of them had been things had happened to them, like they'd been arrested or whatever, and so they were. It's not like the school was full of them. I want to make it clear. Most of the kids at school were kids, but there was this core group of young men who most of them were on the football team, and they didn't get good grades, and they were integrated into the school system. I mean, they have to go to school like anybody else. Anyway, so setting the story for you guys. I was in 10th grade, I believe, at the time, and I was having a bit of difficulty in school because there was an awful lot of bullying at the school that I went to. But in this case, the bullying went a little bit beyond normal. There was this young fella, and his name started with a D, so I'll just call him D. I had him in several classes that I had him in. I mean, he was about 17 or 18 years old, but it fell behind so many years that he was in with us 10th graders. So he was taking 10th grade. And he must have been about 3 years older than me, but he had failed several grades, and been set back for good reason. And he had a little gang of hooligans that used to run around with him. Maybe 3 or 4 of them, other ones. They were like, have you ever seen these different shows and stuff with your typical bullies, and they hang around together with, there's always the leader, and the leader hangs around with several other young bullies, but they're a little bit smaller and not quite as big as him, and they always listen to him because he's the leader, he's the biggest one of the bunch, Well, that's the way it was with this D guy. He had these young hooligans that used to hang around with him, about 3 or 4 of them, and they were like a little gang, and you'd always see them together, So I had this guy in art class. I think it was the one class he was in that was the same class I was in. And he liked this girl. And this girl's name was, well, I'm not giving names here, but anyway, I do remember what her name was. It started with an M, so I'll call her M. So D liked M really much. He was always trying to do things to show off for her or trying to get her things, but she wouldn't pay any attention to him whatsoever. In art class every day, he was always shining toward her and wanting her to shine toward him, but she never would shine toward him. She always shined toward me. And, in those days, I didn't really understand what flirting was all about. I was too young to understand it, I guess, but it went right over my head. But thinking back about it, I know she was flirting with me all the time, And this D guy, he was constantly getting more angry and more angry at me. He saw me as the problem. So, one day after school, they had this big fielded area that was out near what they called the portables, which were these small classrooms that were portable classrooms. There's a whole bunch of them there. It must have been a half a dozen of these portables. And then there was this big field. And we used to wait for the bus out in this big field that was near where the driveway where the buses would loop around and people would get on the bus to take the bus home. And I was waiting out there one afternoon. And D and his little gang spotted me. And they came over and I knew something was up. Anyway, they acted kind of friendly and chummy for once, They didn't really act mean or anything. I knew something was up, though, And he got me over and he was talking to me. And what I didn't know was one of his little friends, one of his little minions, was silently sliding in underneath behind my legs. So I was standing there talking to this D guy. And this minion was was hunched over, and he was on all fours, and he got down in behind my legs where I couldn't see him. And then D gave me a push. And I went sprawling down across his back and fell on my back. And after I fell on my back, this scrawny guy that had crawled in behind me gave me a couple kicks in the side, but he wasn't big and heavy built like D was. He was more of a scrawny kid, He wasn't even as big as me, And so his kicks weren't that much. And anyway, I got over it. And I got on the bus and went home. And this went on. Stuff like this went on for about 3 or 4 days. They were always hunting me down, looking for me, and trying to make my life a misery and bully me. So one morning I came into school and I went to the cafeteria, and there was a friend of mine there, and he'd always been a good friend. I'm not going to give his name either, but again, his name started with a D. And he'd always proved to be a trustworthy friend. He'd always told me the truth. He was a very studious young man. He was about the same age as me, about 14 years old, but he wasn't into sports so much. He was more into different types of things like chemistry, and he always had good schoolwork. He was very interested in science and things like that. And he was a very nice young man. But he was a good friend of mine. I went into the cafeteria. He said, "Come over here. I want to talk to you for a minute." I sat down next to him in the cafeteria, and he said, "Listen," he said, "I was here earlier. And D and his friends and his minions were in here talking, and I overheard what they were saying," he said. I said, What were they saying?" He said, "They're talking about you." He said, "They're just sitting on a table over from me, and they were talking about what they were going to do." And he said, "They said that tomorrow." I said, yeah, what'd they say?" He said, "Well, tomorrow they said that they're going to take you into the boys' bathroom, and they're going to beat the pulp out of you," he said. They're going to beat you up buck good, he said. And he said, then they decided what they were going to do as an excuse. He said they were all going to swear together that they would tell the principal or tell the teachers that you fell and slipped and hit your head on the toilet. Right? So I said, oh my. I didn't know what to make of all this. But now I'd been told, what was going to happen the next day and what they were planning. So I went home that night, and I'm going to tell you, I couldn't get that out of my mind. I couldn't get it out of my mind. I kept thinking about it. And I said to myself, what am I going to do if I go into school tomorrow? These young hooligans, about 4 of them, are going to grab me and carry me into the bathroom and beat the hell out of me. And that's an awful thing for a 14-year-old boy to have to deal with. So I had known from previous experience not to tell my parents about the troubles I was having in school, because I could tell you a story that had happened a few years earlier where I told my dad what was going on the bus. And my dad made a big scene, and then I had more trouble after that than I could deal with at that particular time. So I knew not to tell my parents about this, and I wanted to deal with it myself. I just didn't know how. So I didn't even have an appetite for dinner that night. I was just so concerned, so upset, wondering, what am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this situation? So I don't think I got a whole lot of sleep that night either. Sleep didn't come easy, let me put it that way. I think I did get to sleep, but it was late night sleep, like in the early hours of the morning, So the alarm went off. It was time to go to school. It's winter time in Florida, and it's a little bit chilly that time of year. I think the temperature is in the 50s, so I put on my jacket, I think I put on a pair of dungaree pants and jeans or whatever. Got dressed for school, but I was getting dressed awfully slow. I knew the bus would come. I think the bus used to come like at 8:15 or something like that. Or it might have been 7:45 or something like that. It was early in the morning the bus would come. So I was dragging around the house, about 45 minutes before the bus would show up, and I was like just slowly getting ready but didn't want to go. And I was just still, my mind was just whirring through my mind. What am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this situation? I didn't know how I was going to get out of it, but I said, I'm not going to go in there and get beat up. I know that. Somehow I'm going to get out of this. I was sitting there thinking and thinking and thinking. I couldn't think of nothing. Had to get on the bus, had to go to school. So there was a long road. It's probably a quarter mile down to the bus stop. And this long road was a sandy white road that led down through the woods down to a paved road. And the paved road was only about maybe 600 feet down the paved road was the bus stop. So I left the front of the house and I slowly shut the door behind me and I started walking very slowly toward the bus stop, carrying my book bag and everything else, And as I was walking down that white, powdery, sandy road with woods on either side of the road, and the cool, fresh air of the morning was hitting me. The sky was blue, and it was a beautiful day. It wasn't a breath of wind, and I knew it was going to warm up that afternoon, but that's what it always does in Florida. It gets warm in the afternoon. It might make its way up to into the 70s, mid-70s. It was cool in the morning. It's really nice, It was a bit of dew on everything, a little bit anyway. So I kept walking down toward the bus stop, and I noticed I was walking slower and slower. And my mind was just whirring with, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I just kept walking slower and slower and slower. Finally, when I got within sight of the paved road, I just stopped, and my feet wouldn't move. And I was just sitting there, and I was like a blank. I was kind of like, I wasn't really a blank, but I was just kind of like, hell no, I don't want this. This is just too awful. What am I going to do? And I just stood there in the middle of the road. Of course, those roads weren't used much in those days. Maybe 2 cars a day would go up that road. And there was nobody around. Just me, the blue sky, the bright green trees on either side led into the woods, the brush on either side of the road, and the white, sandy, powdery road. I just stood there, and I must have stood there for about 5 minutes. 3 to 5 minutes. Not moving, just standing there. Not wanting to go forward. Not wanting to go back home. Not knowing what to do, period. And then it just seemed like all of a sudden, I just made a right-hand turn. 90 degrees, just turned my body. And I started slowly walking toward the woods. And I slowly walked inside those woods and just kept walking inside the woods deeper and deeper until I had walked about at least 100 feet into the woods, and you couldn't see the main road anymore. The white powdery road, you couldn't see that anymore. It was too deep in the woods where you couldn't see anything except woods. And suddenly it was like I was in a different world. And I just sat down on the ground. And I said to myself, I'm not going. The hell with it. I ain't getting on that bus. And once I made that decision, and I was inside those woods, it just felt like the biggest weight in the world was lifted off of my chest. And the ground was dry, and the earth was powdery white sand underneath, because that's all there is in Florida. It's just powdery like beach sand. And the plants are growing on top of the beach sand, these scrubby palmetto bushes and things like that. And I just kind of sat down on that sand and kind of squinched my bum a little bit, and it almost made like a seat. And I just kind of leaned back and put my book bag behind my head and just kind of laid down in the woods. And back in those days, there was not any ticks in the woods. Not like there is now. I just kind of laid down there and kind of closed my eyes a little bit and just kind of, because I was still a little bit sleepy because I had to get up early to make the bus, you know. I just kind of laid there and I just felt total peace. All the weight had been lifted off of me, and I just felt totally peaceful. And I said to myself, this is the best decision you've ever made in your life. This is wonderful. The hell with that D kid in school there. The hell with him. He ain't gonna get me. So a little bit of time passed, and I heard the bus come groaning up the asphalt on. He was out on the main paved highway. I heard the bus come groaning up, and I heard him come to a stop, and the brakes go shh, whatever, and stop and letting the kids on at the bus stop where I was, you know. I heard all that, and then I heard him drive down the road further to pick up other kids to fill the bus, you know. And then after about 10 minutes went by, I heard him coming the other way, heading out toward the main road again with the bus full of kids. And then it was quiet again. The bus was gone. I'd missed the bus. So as I was laying there, several of these birds came down and were fluttering around in the brush around me, you know. And I was sitting there watching them and stuff. And I can't remember what I did most of that day, but I whiled the time away. The time just slid by really fast that day. Just sitting in the woods doing basically nothing for about 6 hours. Then I heard the bus come back the other way and letting the kids off. I could hear the kids down probably about 800 feet away from me. I could hear the kids getting off the bus and going back home again. So I got up, dusted myself off, walked back home just like I got off the bus, walked in the front door and pretended like nothing happened. So the next morning came around. And I was prepared. I knew exactly what I was going to do the next morning. I packed a bag. I put in a transistor radio inside my bag, food, a tarpaulin, a hammer, some tent pegs, some rope, all kinds of stuff. I had it all packed inside my bag. So I went inside the woods, and I started to pitch a little, I pitched almost like a tent made of the tarpaulin and tied down with some ropes and stuff. And I had my little radio and I had a blanket to lay on. And I almost like a little camp. And I laid the brush, I took the brush and I was cutting brush with a machete and laying it across and making it into a little lean-to sort of a thing with the canvas tarpaulin and almost like a little camp, almost like a little homeless person camp. But I really liked it, and I had fun building it that day. I think I spent the whole day building it. So time really flew by that day while I was putting my camp together, deep in the woods there. And same thing. When the bus came back later in the day, my job was done, and I packed up my kit bag and headed home just like nothing happened. So 2 weeks went by, and me living in the woods every day, not going to school. In the county, the truant officer sent a letter to my mother. And it said in the letter, "Why is your boy quit school?" And they started to threaten her, like, we're gonna get on your case, if your boy isn't going to school. She said, "What? My boy's not going to school? My boy's been going to school every day." So she came to me and she says, "You've been going to school?" Immediately, the guilty face, she knew the answer immediately. She says, "Why aren't you going to school?" Well, I never told her why. I think I made excuses like, I just don't like it, whatever, school's not for me or something. So she says, "Listen," she said, "you're almost 15, she said, in the state here, Florida. She said, once you turn 15, they can't force you to go to school anymore." And she says, "I can't force you to go to school." She says, "You're almost 15, you're only a couple months away. You'll be turning 15, she said. She said, "If you're not going to go to school, you're not going to laze around the house all day here either." She said, "You're going to have to go to work with your father." And I kind of liked that idea. I said, okay, I'll go to work with my dad. So she said, "Okay, I'll get your dad to arrange it." So my dad was good friends with the guy who owned the body shop where my dad worked. And there was 8 men that worked there. I guess he had a talk with him. And he says, "I want my son here to help out," he told him. He said, "He can clean up my shop. He can clean up the stalls. He can do a lot of things around here," he said. And so the body manager, he says, "I can't pay him." He says, I can't pay him because he's underage. He says, "I can't hire him on." He says, "So I'm not going to pay him anything. He's going to have to work for free." My dad says, "Okay, it's okay. He can work for free." He says, "I want to train him how to do body work. I want to train him in career," my dad said. My dad says, so then my dad worked out a deal with me. He said he took $10 a day out of my dad's wage, which was absolutely practically nothing for my dad because my dad was back then was making like $500-600 a week, so what's 40 or 50, no, $50, off of that. It was not a big deal. And especially he thought that it might help speed him up anyway. So speed up his work. So anyway, that's what happened. The deal was done. My dad paid me out of his paycheck. $10 a day. That was what my pay was going to be. For a kid like me, though, that was a lot of money. And I'm going to tell you guys what. $10 back then had the buying power of 100 now. And I'm serious. So, I mean, for a kid, picture a kid nowadays, if you say, I'm going to pay you $100 a day, it's not bad, And that's the way I saw it, too. That's not bad. I'd take that. $10 a day. So, my mother said to me, she says, you're a working man now, she said. She said, so I expect you to pay room and board. I forget what it was. I think it was like $30 a month or something like that. My mother was, or maybe it was 30 a week or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. No, I don't think it was that much. I don't think it was 30 a week. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, he says, you're going to pay room and board too. So I started going in with my dad, and I'm going to tell you guys what. Those adult men in that shop, there's 8 of them, they treated me with a lot of respect, and they treated me really well. They didn't treat me bad like the kids at school have been treating me. The kids at school were just horrific monsters. What a difference. And, my opinion on it, I remember back then, I kept thinking how kids are monsters, but adults are not bad. Adults are nice, I said to myself, what's the difference? Why is kids like so evil and horrible, and adults are nice, and stuff? It made me wonder about that after I'd started working there, because I didn't have any problems with the men that were working in the shop. Not like I had problems in school, Of course, also it's a type of people too, these young juvenile offenders, that were at that school were the same people that end up in the jail system when they grow up to be adults. And these working class men out there were family men, and there's a different type of person. And it all also reflects upon the way they treat people in life. It's the way I try to treat people in my life. You treat people with respect. And so anyway, so I started working there, and my duties were to keep the shop cleaned up and swept up, of course, and put all the tools back away, which is something that my dad was never all that great at. And it did speed up his productivity immensely. He started making more money, and he was more organized, And also he was teaching me, and after a while, I started to learn how to do some very important things that he had to do himself, like oftentimes when a car would come in that was all smashed, you'd have to tear off the damaged parts in order to get the car ready to be repaired, And after a while, after about 6 months that went by, I could do all that. So my dad, he could go out and have a coffee or whatever, and I'd be working as fast as him, tearing the car apart and stuff. Tearing the fenders off. The fender was all smashed, He'd say, tear off this hood and tear off this fender. He's saying, there's a new hood and a new fender over there. Get them prepped for the painter, sand them off and everything and send them over to the paint shop. And he'd tell me what to do. And then he'd go have a coffee and stuff. And I'd be doing it just as fast as he'd be doing it, And so we worked well together, and we worked there. And I think it was a couple years, because I think I was by the time I quit there, I was almost 18 years old. And that's when I went to work for Norman Brothers Nissan in Orlando. Now, as I was old enough to get my Social Security card. And so I went there to work as a full-fledged auto body mechanic at Norman Brothers Nissan. And I worked there. I only worked there for about 6 months, I think. But those are good times back in the old days. And that's the story of how I got my first job. And I'm going to tell you guys what, I'm never so glad as when I left that high school, and went out into to the real world. Never did look back, and I never regretted leaving school. But I did go back when I was 17 years old, and I got my first real job as a employed person with a Social Security card. Back in those days, I went back to community college, and I started to renew my education. And I think I was about 18 years old at the time when I started to renew my education. And the first thing I did was I got my high school degree, completed high school, completed the last 2 years of high school and got my high school degree, and took my college level entrance exams. So that was the story of how I got my first job at only 14 years old. And it was good times back then. Thank you guys for listening to my show. Like and subscribe. We'll catch you guys in the next episode Monday morning. Boy, we got some trouble in the banking system right now, and I'm not sure how it's all going to pan out. I'll just say, my first inclination to think is that the government's probably going to backstop the FDIC to try to stem off this bank run situation. And it'll probably work. But if the Fed stays on the course that they're on that caused this situation to happen, it will happen again. So they're not out of the woods. Even if they're able to smooth it over this time. But if they continue with this raising interest rates policy, they're going to run right smack into it again. And next time it might not be something that they can stem off as easy or stop. That's my take on it. But I'm not really sure how it'll play out because you just never know. I mean, it could get a lot worse or it could get better. This is one I just can't call, this one. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you guys Monday morning. Bye-bye.